correlation between migration in biblical times and migration in our own. But you can see, going back to this was the path of Abraham, leaving Ur, going up to Haran, moving down into the Fertile Crescent, and then moving down into Egypt and coming back again and settling in what is today Israel, Palestine. So migration's in our spiritual genes, and it's deep in our DNA. But it's also something that's part of our consciousness today. Here's one example of a boat that crossing the Mediterranean today. Thousands and thousands of people have died crossing this area, if you will. And there was one story that Pope Francis heard where a group of refugees like this were on a boat and the boat capsized. And only 8 people survived. And they survived by clinging to a fishing net in the middle of the ocean. But when the fishermen saw them, instead of saving them, they eventually cut their nets and cast them to die into the ocean depths. And Pope Francis was so moved by the indifference of these migrants that he went down to the island near where it happened, a small island named Lampedusa, which is only 6 square miles in area. And there he celebrated Mass by an ocean harbor. But interestingly enough, he used a chalice that was made from the driftwood of a refugee boat. So in the same way, what does it mean to use a chalice in a Mass made from the driftwood of a refugee boat? What is the connection between that chalice and Jesus' story? What's the connection between that chalice and the migrants who are on that boat? What's the connection between that chalice and our story? These are all the things that I think came together in this research. And so sometimes it's also said that what the bishops do at the US border is in fact an American Lampedusa, although they've been celebrating the Mass there well before this event happened. But here you can see the Mass that, in this case, it's in Arizona. This one is near Nogales. And this is the bishops on the American side connecting with bishops who would have been on the other side as well, and celebrating again the Eucharist. And let me be clear, this is not really politicizing the Eucharist. It's actually kind of making a very explicit spiritual faith commitment, which has political consequences. And so what does it mean to proclaim that unity and even to really believe in the eschatological promise of that unity, even why our society is so divided on this issue of migration? So these are some of the things that I'd like to look at today. But as I was working on this book, and it was really a 20-year project, it was a culmination of a lot of research and mostly stories with migrants around the world, around the borders, and trying to happen today with Mexican immigrants or other immigrants from other parts of the world. So this is not a new, there are new particulars, but the kind of the theme itself, the othering of the migrant, is something deep in human history. But to try to just not judge these folks and what they're doing as wrong or different, but to really say, what are they trying to do? Vigilantes really are trying to protect personal property along the border, to prevent unlawful entry, and to fill in the gaps where federal enforcement fails. So say people are crossing the border, they're a nuisance, at best, but they're actually dangerous at worst, and it's just not good that they're coming along without any authorization. So they're concerned citizens who take things into their own hands in order to protect the country and often their property. The Department of Homeland Security, or ICE, Immigration, Customs, and Enforcement, their goal is to enforce policy. They don't make the policy, but their job is to enforce it, to ensure order and prevent unlawful entry, especially of foreign invaders who could harm its citizens. What's interesting is I was doing this research well before 9/11, and after 9/11, even the mentality of the Border Patrol and what they were doing changed dramatically. It went from, basically keeping the border orderly and keeping out drugs to basically preventing terrorists from coming across. In fact, right before Bush was only in office for a few months. In September, you might remember that, September 11th or 13th, I think, they were about to mark a whole new immigration reform plan. But once those planes hit the tower, everything changed, and it changed quickly. And it's very hard to distinguish the terrorist from the immigrant. It all got amalgamated in people's imagination. The third group are political leaders. What they're trying to do is to create federal policy to protect the citizens of the country and to manage its resources. And this has changed a lot over time. That in the early days of the country, we let in almost everybody, but we did make some exceptions. That you could turn away people at Ellis Island and other places if you were an anarchist or had certain diseases. Nowadays, we let in almost nobody, but we make some exceptions. And so what politicians do, how they make decisions on who belongs. In fact, even if you read some of Ben Franklin's works, you can substitute out the word German for Mexican, and it would be the same rhetoric that we often find today in the media. Corporations as well want to hire cheap and or talented labor. They want to maximize profits or sustain a competitive advantage, and they want to sell products at the lowest cost. They're becoming more increasingly vocal on the issue of migration. The next group are church leaders, and really at the heart of the mission of the church is to proclaim a God of life, to protect the rights of human beings who are made in God's image and likeness. And Pope Paul VI said the mission of the church is ultimately to build a civilization of love. So it's to denounce injustice and it's to announce the reign of God. And then finally, human rights advocates, they're trying to protect the rights of immigrants. They're trying to protect the exploitation of the vulnerable and to fight for human dignity. So borrowing from different sort of points of view, but having a lot in common with what the church is trying to do. Their goal is often to fight for human life and for human rights. So from this perspective, everybody has a position and there's a validity to each one of those positions. So how do you begin to sort out those positions and begin to prioritize those and begin to assess the relative worth or not of those positions? This is where it gets a little complicated. So as we go a little deeper in this, one of the things that we began to see is that underneath these arguments, there are different rights at stake. There are different rights that people are trying to advance. This group is really trying to advance property rights and protect individual property rights. Even the church, too, recognizes there is a right to own property, and there's a valid right to do that. Then and how does that right interface with other rights? This group is really trying to emphasize the role of sovereign rights, namely the right of a nation to protect its border, something also the church recognizes. Thirdly, there are cultural rights. In this case, how do we determine what it means to be an American? And by what criteria do we do this? It's an experiment to bring together so many different kinds of nations and cultures under the rule of law. This group is trying to fight for economic rights and how to keep it fair and open. This group is trying to really speak about natural rights, namely those given by God. And this group is looking at human rights classically defined. So when you look at it this way, then the question is, how do you begin to prioritize these rights? How do you begin to assess one right over another right? How do these interrelate with each other? This is where it gets more complicated. But however you look at it, there are really three fundamental positions that come down to the political policies. This group says, close the borders, keep them out, protect what we have, put more agents on the border, build a bigger wall. This is mostly Democrat and Republican policies that we've had for the last 45 years. This group is saying, look, they need the work and we need the workers. Let's create a legal system that allows people to go back and forth. The last time we really tried this, with mixed results, but it was when World War II happened, when the men were off in Europe fighting the war, and there was a deficit in the labor needs in the United States. So we brought braceros, people from Mexico, in, to the United States who worked there for a period of time as guest workers. This is really one of the few places where there can be sort of somewhat of a cost-benefit analysis here and allowing workers to come. This group here is trying to really make the case for legalization, saying the church in particular, saying you can't simultaneously benefit from the labor of undocumented workers and labor of migrant workers and make a profit from them at the same time. And that there should be some right to an earned path to citizenship. And this became very clear when I was working in rural communities in Mexico, that a lot of these communities were just women and children. So you can't just also have people come up to, say, work in the United States while the families are back home. That creates a social disintegration. So these groups would make a case that if it's not just an economic analysis or an economic cost we're talking about, it's a social cost as well, when that looks at the disintegration of the family. Now, here's where it begins to shift. So at this point, I'm going to make basically an argument. So up until now, I'm presenting different positions. At this point, you're welcome to disagree with me. You're welcome to challenge what I say. But here, I'm going to be very explicit about it. I'm going to make an argument here. is that this point where things begin to change and things are not all equal is really what language you use in the debate. So the heart of really what I want to look at today is not just not just more information about migration, but really a new narrative about migration. One in this case that we'll get to is theologically informed. But how you tell that narrative depends a lot on language. And those of you who've done rhetorical studies or literary studies, feminist studies, you know that language shapes your reality. And the language you use in the debate are going to really shape reality. And so this group actually sees them as aliens. This is actually the official language of the US government. They're aliens. And so it's rather striking. I remember one time being with a colleague of mine from Canada, and he said, he married somebody from Canada, and he says, "Is that an immigration hearing?" And as they were talking, they were going back and forth with this officer. And so he looked over at this colleague I know and said, "How long have you known this alien?" He's speaking about his wife. I was just like, what? It was just sort of like, it was like, what do you mean? And, so that the language you use in that, in fact, my first book, I was on the spirituality of undocumented immigrants, and I thought, I was going to call it Alien Spirituality, and so I thought maybe Sigourney Weaver could do the introduction to it or something, But, when you think about that, I remember one time being at this conference in Geneva with other folks from the United Nations, and it was a church kind of UN conversation, and so there were some people in that conversation where they said, the states gives rights to these people, and I looked at them and I said, no, they don't actually. They said, God gives rights to these people. It's the state's job to make sure those rights are protected. But where you start on that question makes a big difference. So these are more than just semantics. The rooting of your arguments and how you use language in that narrative is going to have a lot of ethical dimensions to it. So this group has a very particular way of looking at it. This group sees them as workers, and actually, I'm not an economist, but if actually you look at really hardcore economists, even somebody like Bill Evans in our university, when they've studied this, that they basically view to say, are they a drain? And so the rhetoric and the narrative is they're going to take from us, they're going to steal from us, they're just going to use social services, they're going to be a drain on us. And by the way, actually, that when you look at refugees around the world, 85% of all refugees basically are in developing countries. So the burden of the resources dedicated to migrants and refugees is not in, if you will, in Europe and North America. Actually, it's in the developing countries that have to absorb the burden of a lot of refugees. And so that's just a fact. But in this case, workers, arguments can be on either side, whether they give or take, but it's actually about parity. But Bill Evans would say they actually take a little more in the first 7 years, and then after that, the evidence is that they actually give back a lot more. And when you think about some of the major kind of industries in the United States right now, Google, Intel, eBay, Sun Microsystems, these were all started by immigrants who are employing hundreds of thousands of people. So it's not just that they're kind of working illegally in the fields, but they're actually part of initiative and creativity and the economic engine that makes the country thrive. This third group, and this is not a particularly deep thought, but it's an important one because this group sees them as people. And if we can't actually get this piece right, then nothing else will hold together. Because if they are human beings made in the image and likeness of God, that roots the ethics of this in a very different moral equation than if they're just people that can be moved around. In fact, some of the harder kind of instances is when you hear stories about migrants that be working in the field for weeks at a time, and they'd be told they'd be paid at the end of the job, and then they come back, and then finally, as soon as they're done with the work, someone calls the border patrol and rounds up and kind of, that kind of exploitation, is a sin that cries to heaven. That's just really one that I think is such an offense to God. But this is really the kind of issue here, I think, in terms of looking at this perspective. But here's really where another place where it breaks down, and I would say, giving this talk, over the years, probably one area that is rather striking to me is really the legal question. And so this really comes from educated people, even as that somehow in some form or another with different levels of aggressiveness and hostility, they will ask me, Father, which part of the legal don't you understand? And Don, I remember you one time saying, you just want to say back to them sometimes, like, which part of the gospel don't you understand? That can be, have its own kind of reverberations. But the bottom line is, the issue really, I think, rather is which part of the law don't you understand? Because Thomas Aquinas says there are in fact 4 laws. Mark Portman could get into this in a lot more detail than I could. But Aquinas really says that there are 4 laws. There is a natural law by which parents need to feed their families. There's a civil law which societies use to organize themselves for the common good. There's a divine law which we know through Scripture about feeding the hungry and the thirsty and so on. And there's eternal law through which God keeps the universe going. The key as human beings, for justice to happen, those laws have to align somehow. But if you have civil laws, like let's think about racial discrimination, that you can't use the same bathroom or go to the same schools. If you have racial discrimination that are at variance, civil laws are at variance with natural laws, that's where the discord results. So the goal is to bring this into harmony. But how this plays out is this group is going to emphasize civil laws. And so the arguments are usually like, what I call arguments of the invisible mind. Like, what are you, crazy? These people are going to ruin our culture. I mean, they're going to take our jobs. They're going to make us eat salsa and tacos for the rest of our life. It's just something that's just, going to just ruin everything. So it's like any rational person would never let them in. Although they'll be quick to point out, especially now with all the drama going on in Texas right now, it's look, we didn't cross the border. The border crossed us. So if you go to places like San Antonio, remember there was this woman there once who, the San Fernando Cathedral has been there since the early 1700s. And she said, my ancestors were here when this was part of New Spain. They were here also when this was a part of Mexico. They were here also when this was the state of Texas. They were here also when it's the United States. He said, we're not sure which country is coming through here next, but we're still going to be here. So when you think about it, that these laws do change. This group is going to emphasize the economic laws. Classically speaking, Adam Smith spoke about the power of the invisible hand. But the problem is Adam Smith never had in mind a capitalist economy. I mean, he had a human economy that was bound together by non-capitalist moral sentiments. But I think that the danger here is that if we too quickly say, let's let the economy work this out, we become vulnerable to other idols. And probably the most common of which would be money theism. Is that we really make money into the ultimate measure of all value, and therefore we use that in such a way that it has very consequential human costs. This last group really appeals to the natural laws, or what the United Nations calls the invisible heart. So that raises questions about what it means to be a society, how we come together, how we even disagree with each other, but how we also treat those who are most vulnerable. All these are at stake. But in the end, there's one final and important question underneath this, which is the question of who is the other? So really, this is the most universal question here, and that really boils down to everybody from my roommate, my family members, to someone who's a migrant. And so while the dominant political narrative right now is moving towards the othering of the migrant, there is a whole other way of looking about this. But if you look at these groups together, this first group is going to emphasize really fundamentally a fear of the other. This second group is going to look at the usefulness of the other. And this third group is going to look at, ultimately, the connection to the other. So this is where the deeper migration needs to happen. We may find ourselves in any one of these quadrants, maybe at different points in time, but the question is, can we move through these different parts into places of greater communion, connection, and for that to happen, reconciliation needs to happen. So let me summarize the second part by just saying that what we have at the border then is not just a geopolitical issue. We also have a tension zone that really is looking at a tension between sovereign rights and human rights, namely the right of a nation to protect its borders, but also the right of a people to a dignified life and even to migrate if necessary. Secondly, it's the right of a nation to order and organize a system of regulations for the common good, namely civil law, but also natural law, the right of people to provide for families, to feed, educate, and shelter them. Thirdly, it's the tension between national security and human insecurity, namely the right of a nation to protect its inhabitants from harm and violence, especially from the outside. And also the right of people to protect their families from undue need, hunger, and excessive poverty and vulnerability. And for this last part, I'm going to make a different shift here, and that is really moving from, I think, a tension between citizenship and discipleship, and that is moving from